Hey guys, how you doing? Want to talk today a little bit about scope rings. So they are something, or scope mounts, something that generally gets left behind when it comes to rifles. And why is that? Well, the exciting parts really are the rifle and the scope. So people put a lot of thought into that and they don't mind spending the money on that. So you might spend £2,000-3,000 on a rifle, you might spend the same on a scope. People don't maybe like to spend quite so much money on the scope, but it's sensible to spend decent money on the scope, especially if you do a bit of low light shooting or you're doing extreme long range. But we've discussed a little bit about that before. I'll put some links up at the end into a scope review and some discussion about that. So why am I an advocate of specific scope rings or high quality scope rings? Because you've spent all that money on those two things and then you're going to cheap out on the one bit that fits them together. And that's a bit like buying a Ferrari and then putting some remold cheap budget tyres on it. That's the one bit that contacts the Ferrari with the road. So arguably you'd be better off spending a bit less money on the car and get really amazing tyres than you would buying an amazing car and having really rubbish tyres, because the whole thing's handling is going to be dictated by those tyres no matter how good the engine is. And it's a bit like this: I could have the best scope in the world, but the scope's performance to some degree is going to be dictated by how it's mounted, and certainly the system is going to be dictated by how it's mounted. So if you buy really cheap, if you buy off eBay, you know, some unknown scope ring manufacturer, or you know, worse, you go like Wish or Banggood or some Chinese like cheapo deal. And I'm not saying that all Chinese products are bad, there's plenty of good Chinese manufacturers, but we all know that there's those like special budget Chinese like marketplaces that you can go to that really cater for low end cheaply produced stuff, and what you're going to get is junk. So the material spec's going to be poor, the metal's not going to be up to, you know, taking any sort of knock. It's certainly not going to be up to dealing with any increased recoil over a period of time. The tolerances, the machining tolerances of that are going to be awful. So when it comes to things like your pick rail on here, this is machined to very tight tolerances. That's why decent scope rings cost money, because you're paying for tightly toleranced machine work. That means that when you screw it down, you get a really snug, tight fit, and the thing sits exactly as it should. You know, it's not sitting at some weird angle, it's not sitting like off to the side or twisted or anything like that. It is pointing in exactly the direction it's supposed to be. And that really matters with scopes, because a tiny amount of angular dysfunction at the rifle end, if you go 1,000 meters down range, you know, that inch at 100 yards turns into 10 inches at 1,000 yards, etc. We all know that about your minute of angle measurements. So, you know, 0.5 mil out on this means your scope's pointing 0.5 mil out, means you're going to be burning up most of your windage by the time you get down range. And then worse even still is that if this starts moving around, which if it hasn't got tight tolerances, it won't grip, it won't mate to the other surface properly. So a pick rail is machined, Picatinny rail's machined to very defined tolerances. So's this. When you screw this down and you tune it up to 40-50 inch-pounds, torque it down, that's mated to that surface perfectly all along the surface. If you've got it badly machined, there will only be parts of each surface that connect, because, you know, it's not fitted properly. And when you only get partial connection and then you stick a load of recoil energy through it, that's going to start moving things around. So one shot it might be pointed 1/4 mil to the left, then the next shot it might be pointed 1/4 mil to the right. that makes it impossible to zero that system, because what you'll get is your shots will be drifting off to the left and right, and you'll keep adjusting the scope thinking, oh, what's changed, you know, what's changed, and that won't help you, because you're just going to chase that misalignment that keeps changing every single shot that you take, especially in the bigger calibers. So where you might get away with really cheap scope rings is on like a PCP air rifle, because no recoil energy, you're not really chucking it around, you know, you're not treating it roughly, you're not shooting at really long distances. So yeah, you're going to get away with that. I wouldn't go too expensive for that, but I still go reasonably expensive because I don't want to break. And if they break and there's a scope on it and it's up on a tripod mount and that scope falls on the floor, that's also smashed my scope to pieces. So now I've got to buy a new scope. I'd rather just buy a decent set of rings. So I'd probably look to spend about between 50 and £100 for an air rifle mount. If I'm mounting something on a centerfire rifle, especially on like say 338 and above calibers, I will always spend £200 to £300+ on the rings. I like these fur rings. These particular ones are QD quick release. They've got a little bubble level in the back so you can look at your cant. I'm not, to be honest, bothered about QDs. This one I use for work because I have to take it on and off a lot of rifles for demos and stuff like that, but normally I just go for something with these Allen screws on and it just stays on the rifle that I'm using, so I never bother with changing it around. Make sure that you torque everything down properly. Again, I think in the video I spoke a bit about that. Have a look at your manual, have a look at the manufacturer's recommendations. It's normally about 20 to 25 inch-pounds on the small screws that actually fit the rings together, and then on the mounting screws on the base you're probably looking at between 40 and 50 inch-pounds on those. So I think it's worth buying expensive. I normally buy Sphere. I've also got an RPA mount there from the UK. Not sure if they're still making those. I'm not even sure RPA are making anything at the moment, but they were pretty good rings. You know, they're well manufactured, they're precision machined, and that's what you're paying for, that precision machining. So anyone that thinks, oh, there's these companies that are just sticking loads of money on there because it's a brand name and I can just save money by not buying that brand name, that's not correct. I know how much it costs to machine precision metal components because we do a lot of that at work, and every time you increase that tolerance, you know, you make that tolerance finer, you're increasing the price, because it starts to become an issue of wastage and stuff. You know, the finer that tolerance gets, the more items that the place will have to throw away, or the longer they'll have to take over machining processes to make sure that they're not falling outside of that tolerance spec. So you're paying for like length of time of machining, or possibly them having some disposable items which they've got to bin because they didn't make the cut. So there's a good reason why you pay a lot of money for those, and I would say paying £300 for a set of decent scope rings. I like these uni mounts. They don't flex. You know, some people prefer 2 rings. Maybe if you've got an ultralight hunting rifle, that is a sensible idea because you're cutting down on weight. But for the rugged sort of stuff we're doing, I don't want the sort of separate rings. I find the uni mounts are just much easier. I can leave them sat on the scope like I've got with that. I don't have to worry about them, you know, being aligned in specific planes with each other, because you literally just sit the scope in and then cinch these down, and it's only going to be aligned in one way. You've only got to worry about aligning the scope to the base, not each separate mount and ring set. And then of course, if your rifle hasn't come with a pick rail and you put one of those on, that's another thing. Don't scrimp on, because if you buy a really cheap pick rail that's badly engineered, that's going to it won't provide a good mating surface with the top of your rifle's receiver, and then you're going to again have movement there. So if you get cheap rings and a cheap pick rail, there's two places that you're going to get movement in, and that's going to be a horrendous setup. You'll just be chasing zero forever. You can get around that, you know, if you've got a cheap pick rail, you can bed them, but that is a major pain in the butt. I wouldn't recommend it because you end up with like epoxy leaking everywhere, and it's just a pain that you don't need to go through. And if you price it out, say I buy a pick rail for 25 quid, then I got to spend half a day bedding that thing, or I could just spend 70 quid on a pick rail and I don't have to bed it, and it's absolutely perfect. You know, I value my time, and I don't really want to be covered in epoxy messing about with stuff just to save a few pounds. So I highly recommend that. These spur mounts will last for years. I've never had a problem with them. I mean, I've been running them on 50 cals, the same mounts, for now 7 years, and they've had tens of thousands of 50 cal rounds shot through them, and they're still never ever had an issue with them, not even one. I think when I saw the spur guys at a show, I said, you know, your components are the only component in a rifle system that I've never had fail. Not once. I've had scopes fail, I've had parts of rifles fail, all that. I've had bipods fail, everything you can think of. Never once have I had a spur mount fail. So you know, and I call it spur. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. It might be spur. Don't kill me in the comments, but you know what I mean. It's I think it's SPHUR. So brilliant mounts. They're worth the money that they're charging for them, and I would strongly suggest that you buy them if you're buying yourself a new rifle system. Thanks a lot. Take care. See you soon.